We pursue this vision through a range of student and educator programs and knowledge and field building efforts that reach students and educators in Durham and beyond. If you haven't already, I encourage you to check out our website at hillcenter.org. Through this community education series, we aspire to offer free, practical, research-based strategies to help students as well as the parents, teachers, and professionals who support them. While we always strive to make our topics relevant and timely, I fear that tonight's topic of anxiety is especially so. The social anxiety, isolation, grief, anxiety, depression our kids have experienced during the pandemic are real and concerning and bubbling over into all aspects of their and our lives. This is especially true for students with learning differences and ADHD, who are more likely to have anxiety in general. So whether you are here as a parent, an educator, a professional, or other interested caregiver, I applaud you for taking the time to learn more about anxiety and how you can help children and teens management. We hope that this information is useful and perhaps can help reduce your own anxiety as well. So thank you for being here. Our next session will be on February 3rd, Executive Function Solutions to Jumpstart the Second Semester, and we hope we'll see you then as well. Before introducing our speaker, let me cover a few housekeeping details. This session is being recorded and it will be sent out tomorrow over email along with a short survey. Please complete the survey. Your feedback is important to us in developing future sessions and in fact helped to inform the design of tonight's session already. There's a link to the slide presentation in the chat, and the slides will also be included in tomorrow's email. All of our participants are muted, but you can submit questions and comments to the presenter and the Hill team at any time using the chat. We encourage you to use that feature as we will be collecting questions throughout that we will use at our moderated Q&A at the end. The chat will only be visible to the presenter and our tech and support team. Dr. Riddle will present for about an hour, and then we'll have a Q&A moderated by Hill's counselor and assistant head of school, Glennis Hill Chandler. So now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome back Dr. David Riddle. Dr. David Riddle is a licensed clinical psychologist and president of Chapel Hill Pediatric Psychology. He has more than 20 years of experience in pediatric psychology, particularly in the field of attention and learning disorders. I have a strong personal affinity for David, as not only was he head of the search committee that hired me at Hill and my first board chair, but he also has evaluated my son twice and advised him and us on our own journey managing anxiety and parenting a child with learning differences. Dr. Riddle delivered a session on ADHD in October, and it was so well received that we asked him to come back to address a topic related to mental health. We are lucky and grateful to have him as part of the Hill community and with us here tonight to share his expertise. So let me turn it over to David.
Thank you, Beth. I'm humbled by your intro and pleased to be back. Let me welcome participants as well to tonight's talk. I know you're here because you love or you care for or you teach someone who most likely is experiencing significant worries and anxieties. I hope the information you learn tonight will begin to address some of your concerns without creating more anxiety, because I am acutely aware that talking about anxiety can make some people anxious. And it's a category of worry all to itself. It's called worry about worry. I give you permission tonight to focus only on the first part of the statement, the original worry and anxiety. Our focus for this evening, dealing with our child's anxiety, ultimately needs to begin with dealing constructively with our own. All children, particularly the younger, are going to mirror the feeling state of their caregiver. Be kind to yourself. Before tonight's presentation, I did a survey of my colleagues here at Chapel Hill Pediatric Psychology and asked them, what do you think is the most important message that I can give to the participants tonight? And they said, know that there's no perfect way to parent or to teach during a pandemic. We are all figuring this out as we go. There is emerging research, but we didn't have it beforehand. So be kind to yourselves. Now, with all of that being said, let's take some time to create some space for tonight's presentation. Humor me, if you will. I invite you to find a comfortable sitting posture where you are. I want you to feel free to close your eyes if you like, or find a spot on the wall or on the screen on which to focus. I want you to take a full breath and let it out. And then resume your normal breathing. Notice the sensations of your body, the thoughts that are going through your head. Acknowledge the thoughts and sensations without judgment. They're not good nor bad, they're just thoughts. And when you notice those thoughts, I want you to return to your breath without trying to push the thoughts away. When we focus on our breath, we help clear our mind. Notice the rise and fall of your chest as you inhale and exhale. And again, if negative thoughts arise, acknowledge them without judgment and return to your breath. Take a few more seconds and return to the screen. I wanted that exercise to set the tone for the way that we approach our students, our children, our adolescents, and understand that they mirror what they see in us. So I've given you a tool to use. I also think it's important to know, people call this mindfulness or a meditation practice. Meditation really is not about trying to push thoughts out of your head. And it's impossible really to push thoughts out of our heads. What meditation practice is sitting or walking and paying attention to our breath. And when thoughts arise, note them and then return to the breath. And over time, what will happen is the thoughts will come a little more slowly to a trickle, but there's no use of trying to push them away because they get sticky feet when you do that. So pay attention to them and return to your breath. I want you to remember that for part of what we're doing later on. Okay, an overview. First off, know that fear of threats is normal, and I know you all know that. Early on in our evolutionary history, we developed the capacity to respond to threats in our environment. Some people call that the lizard brain or the reptilian brain, where their purpose in life was to eat, grow, reproduce, and avoid getting destroyed. Fight, flight, or freeze are the responses our body uses to deal with these threats. The threats can be major, like being chased by a wild animal, or more subtle, fear of not being accepted. For those of you who joined me last October, I presented Dr. Dan Siegal, of whom I'm a big fan, who does a lot of work on mindfulness and parenting. And I wanted to share this video with you on the hand model of the brain because I believe it is a little trick that you can use with your students. So let's pay attention to what Dr. Siegal has to say.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is very important because sometimes we can have all sorts of things happen in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all of that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child, and that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
Okay, I wanted to share that because I think it does present a really nice way of helping to explain to our children the way that our brain handles this arousal. And arousal is very much a part of anxiety conditions. Here's a drawing of what Dr. Siegal was talking about. You'll notice the areas 2 and 3. Those are the places that where the arousal originates. And number 1, the neocortex is the part that helps modulate that arousal response. And those are the things that we hope to be teaching our children. Okay. The feeling of anxiety happens when we sense a threat. Depending on our assessment of the threat, we respond by taking action. Now, I want you to know there are both positive and negative outcomes. The positive outcome is we stay safe if we're in danger. We take care of business that needs to be taken care of. And interestingly, our performance improves up to a point. I wish I'd drawn a graph, but if you plot performance against anxiety as anxiety and performance, as anxiety rises, performance improves up to a point, and then it drops. So anxiety can be helpful. The negative outcomes, however, we engage in chronic escape and avoidance, which leads to developing an anxiety disorder. And it begins to impact our relationships, our work, and our academics. Fear versus anxiety. Most anxiety is based in fear, and this is the first step, but fear is an emotional response to an immediate threat. It's more associated with a fight or flight reaction, either to staying to fight or leaving to escape danger. Anxiety, however, which rises out of fear, causes people to try to avoid situations that can trigger or worsen their symptoms. Job performance, schoolwork, personal relationships, all of these things can be impacted. In general, for a person to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, the fear or anxiety must be out of proportion to the situation or age inappropriate and hinder our ability to function normally. Just some overall thoughts on anxiety disorders. So when we move beyond simple fear and worry to anxiety disorder, here's what we know. It's the most common child and adolescent mental health disorder. On average, 1 in 8 children in the ages of 3 to 18 have an anxiety disorder. If you look at graphs of the prevalence, and I was going to include one, but it started getting unwieldy, so I didn't put it in. But the increase, particularly during the adolescent years, is staggering. As we know, anxiety disorders present in a myriad of ways, and we're going to talk about that. An interesting finding is anxiety disorders tend to run in families. Anxiety comes in spikes, triggered by particular situations, and it frequently co-occurs with other issues like ADHD, LD, autism spectrum, chronic medical condition. Looking at the percentage of co-occurrence with ADHD, folks who've been diagnosed, anywhere between 30 to 50% of those may have an anxiety disorder. With learning differences, it's 20 to 30%. And with autism spectrum disorder, it's around 40%. There are visible signs of anxiety and less obvious signs. And that is what our staff here have been tasked with during the pandemic, because there have been a lot less obvious signs that we are finding to be true signs of anxiety disorders. For the visible signs, there's physical distress, upset stomach, there's fleeing or escaping, there's outright statements of anxiety of what they're worried about. I'm worried that you're going to get COVID and that you're going to die. Extreme distress upon contact with a feared object, refusal to engage in activities, or refusal to be alone or without a parent. The less obvious signs tend to be more clingy behavior, particularly with younger children. Irritability is a biggie. And many of you may have children who express their anxiety through irritable moods. Avoidance, physical complaints, reassurance-seeking behavior, argumentativeness. They're not always trying to be difficult. Sometimes they are showing they're anxious, and then extreme shyness. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the main types of anxiety disorders, and understanding that it may be that many of you do not have a child who has been diagnosed or is diagnosable with anxiety, but I'm sharing this with you for the purpose of helping to figure out what your next steps might need to be with your child. Generalized anxiety is probably one of the most frequent, both for children, adolescents, and adults. So people with generalized anxiety have a lot of worry and fear that seems to have no real cause. The worry may be more intense than the situation calls for. Children or teens with generalized anxiety often worry about many things, such as future events, past behaviors, social acceptance, family matters, their own personal abilities, their school performance. All kids and teens have some anxiety. It's a normal part of growing up, but sometimes worries and fears don't go away, and they may interfere with the child's normal activities. In these cases, an anxiety disorder most likely is present. As we have said before, experts believe generalized anxiety is caused by both biological and environmental factors. A child inherits a tendency to be anxious. There's an imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain, norepinephrine and serotonin most likely play a part. Or a child can learn anxiety and fear from family members and others. For example, a child with a parent who is afraid of thunderstorms may learn to fear thunderstorms. So there can be some social modeling. Traumatic events may also cause generalized anxiety. And these kinds of events may include such things as death of a parent, a divorce, a serious family accident, or an illness. Agoraphobia, which is somewhat is seen in older adolescents and adults and young adults, involves staying at home to avoid feeling uncomfortable or panicky, needing a specific person to be present to face certain situations. Phobias. I've talked to many of the pediatricians downstairs from our office for kids who are getting vaccines, and there's been a strong phobia of needles that's going on these days. But specific things like blood or needles, dogs or other animals, storms or bad weather, the dark, high places, enclosed places are all typical types of phobias. Social anxiety. And this is an area that some researchers are predicting is going to increase once we are past the major part of the pandemic. Social anxiety includes things like being nervous around people you don't know well, being hard to talk to people you don't know well, presenting shyness, getting nervous having to do something while others watch, being nervous about going to parties where you don't know people well. Some researchers are thinking we may have lost some of our skill in being around people, and we're going to have to relearn it when things open back up. Separation anxiety is quite a common anxiety disorder in younger children. Fear of sleeping away from home, preferring to stay close to parents, worrying about something bad happening to parents, being afraid to be alone at home for an older child. Panic attacks. Sorry for the cartoon figure. I couldn't find a picture of a human having a panic attack, but I thought this cartoon figure accurately portrayed what a panic attack looks like. If you have had one, you know it feels like you're having a heart attack. With panic attacks, you often feel sick even when nothing's wrong. You become frightened out of the blue. It becomes hard to breathe. You feel like you're passing out. You fear that you're losing control. Your heart's racing, you're shaky, you're sweating, you're feeling dizzy. You may have a sensation of choking. These can be quite debilitating, and there can be fear of having a panic attack in public, which is that worry about worry that I talked about earlier. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is one of those anxiety disorders that seems to be on the rise, particularly in pandemic conditions, because we worry about the virus, that we have germs or virus on ourselves, or someone else will get hurt due to your actions. Or the compulsions doing things over and over that you can't resist doing, like counting, washing your hands, counting lines on the floor, things like that. And most recently, pandemic-induced anxiety. This does not appear in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. I'll be interested to see if it makes its debut in the next edition. At the beginning of the pandemic, most people were on high alert, experiencing fear and worry over the impact the virus may have. As scientists and healthcare professionals gained more understanding of the virus and how to treat the symptoms of COVID-19, society began to settle into a new and unfamiliar routine of living with a pandemic. Some people developed more anxiety as a result of it. Some people didn't take it seriously enough. I think it remains to be seen what the lasting impact of this will be. So this was another question that I asked my colleagues regarding what were they seeing in the populations of folks that they were seeing. Contamination fears, fears of getting the virus. Many days walking into my office from where I would do many Zoom calls, there would be hordes of people in the parking lot or at the door waiting to be called into the pediatric office. And as someone walks up to the door and goes through the door, it was heartbreaking to see this sea of people just part and move back to give you wide berth because of a fear of contamination. Loneliness and isolation, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, and still the case for a lot. Screen fatigue, that's probably more the professionals than the kids, but I don't know. Just being tired. Increase in parental stress, as well as an increase in marital discord. Being around your spouse all the time without a chance to pursue your own life sometimes can be stressful. All of these things lead to an increase in parent-child conflict, particularly around the last one on this list, increased screen time. Academic underachievement, teachers in the audience will know about this. And the one thing that we've seen a lot of are unmasking of latent problems. A lot of students who may have attention and executive functioning issues that would not show up until later in their lives have shown up much earlier because of the demands of trying to keep up with assignments virtually, getting assignments turned in, being able to access all of the websites that they needed to. So there was much testing that went on in our practice related to these difficulties. And lastly, increased screen time for children and adolescents, not only for time in school, but after school. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what is beginning to emerge as research. There have been some recent studies that have come out that have taken a look at the amount of screen time, because this has been a concern of folks for some time, of professionals and teachers. The researchers summarized data from a survey of over 5,400 adolescents ages 12 to 13 years old in May of 2020. The participants reported a mean total daily screen use of 7.7 hours. Most of it spent gaming or watching or streaming movies, videos, or TV shows. Now, this was above and beyond whatever time they spent online for school, which was higher than a pre-pandemic estimate of 3.8 hours a day from the same cohort. And then researchers found that there were poorer mental health and greater perceived stress were associated with higher total screen use, whereas more social support and coping behaviors were associated with lower total screen use. Then there was another study that looked specifically at what were some of the outcomes of spending so much time on the screen. Examining the potential association between specific forms of screen use and symptoms of depression, anxiety, conduct problems, irritability, hyperactivity, and inattention among over 2,000 children and youth aged 2 to 18 years, and this was in Ontario, Canada, from May 2020 to April 2021. The participants came from 2 community cohorts as well as 2 clinically referred cohorts. Parents answered repeated questionnaires related to their children's health behaviors and mental health systems during the pandemic. Children's daily television, digital media time, video game time, electronic learning time, and video chatting time served as the exposure variables. And then parents reported symptoms of childhood depression, anxiety, conduct, irritability, hyperactivity, and attention according to validated standardized tools. So the results showed higher television or digital media time correlated with higher levels of conduct problems and hyperactivity and attention among younger children with a mean age of 5.9. More time using television or digital media correlated with higher levels of depression, anxiety, and inattention. In the adolescent sample, more time playing video games correlated with higher levels of depression, irritability, inattention, and hyperactivity among older children and youth, mean age of 11.3 years. Now, some of you will say, and I agree, a correlation does not prove causality. And this will be information into which we'll dig deeper to see what exactly that link is. But there is an association that does need to be explored. In addition to high screen use and social isolation, the worsening of child mental health could be related to the displacement of sleep, physical exercise, and other pro-social activities which were disrupted during the pandemic. The exposure to online bullying, stressful news, and harmful advertisements during screen use could also contribute to poor child mental health outcomes. So it's not just the act of being on the screen, but all the things that go with it, particularly the schedule, the routine, the displacement of sleep, the lack of physical exercise, the lack of pro-social activities. All of these things were disrupted and could cause the type of findings that they found. Now, don't tell your kids that I shared these studies with you. They'll never want to see me. No. I think it's important to know, though, that the other thing that I've seen, and these studies do not address this, there have been some benefits, I think, to children being able to be on their screens during the pandemic, particularly with regard to keeping in touch with friends and fostering relationships and being part of team play, especially with video games. There's got to be a balance, though. And when all of those activities began to disrupt the schedule, disrupt sleep, disrupt the ability to get physical exercise, I think that's where we began to get into trouble. Okay. So let's talk about some tips to help children and teens manage their anxiety during this pandemic. And I do hope so much that we are on the tail end of it. I don't know that we know for sure, but I think for whatever is the remainder, I think these tips may be helpful. All right. One thing that we have seen here and I know you guys have seen in your own lives, that it's really important to get a balanced routine and schedule going, particularly with sleep and a balance between work and play. Anxiety can cause issues with both falling and staying asleep. Going to bed every day at the same time and maintaining a healthy bedtime routine does improve sleep quality. Having a good night's sleep every night can help decrease anxiety during the waking hours. I've heard stories of students and talked to students who are, particularly adolescents, who have been up to 2, 3 in the morning and not getting up on time to do virtual school when that existed. Not a good practice, not a good practice at all. And so regular sleep schedule, I think, is important regardless of pandemic status. We need our sleep to be able to pay attention the next day. Each day, it's important to balance work and play, to balance out tasks that may feel stressful, like school or chores, with fun activities, socially distanced, social interactions. It's important to take breaks. Limit the amount of time you're paying attention to and worrying about the news. I'm telling this to you as parents as well, because that's where a lot of the kids are picking up on the news. Limiting the news intake, I'll start with a little TV first. With consistently bad news of the pandemic streaming in from social media and other online outlets, it's important to limit the time that we spend listening and reading about what's going on in the world. I'm not suggesting that we isolate ourselves totally from that information, but a steady diet of it increases our own anxiety, and our children feed off of that anxiety. Even if you're not paying attention to the news, engagement on social media can keep us in a chronic state of activation, which may lead to increased anxiety. Now, the hourglass. What I'm referring to here, I want you to think about giving yourself permission to worry at a designated time, because worry is going to happen. Remember, I said earlier, and we all know intuitively, worry and fear are normal human emotion. It's unhealthy to keep feelings of worry bottled up. Keeping a journal where you can express your worries during a designated time each day, say 15 to 30 minutes each day, can be important. I wouldn't suggest designating the time right before bed because it can create sleep issues, but I would say that one way to get the thoughts from our head outside of ourselves is to be writing them down or having your child dictate them to you so that you can have a worry journal. After you've done writing down the worries, walk away and do something fun or pleasurable. Do something that will nurture yourself. Keeping yourself busy with a balance of safe and positive distractions. I know that we all have tried to stay in contact with friends and family, and I'm sure that many of you spent a virtual Thanksgiving holiday, probably in 2020, maybe in 2021. Was not fun at all. But being able to touch base with people who are important to us is really important. And that is one thing that I will say about children and screen times and the app Discord that you guys may have heard of, where kids have been able to talk to each other. I think is a way that they've been able to stay in touch with their friends. And of course, diving into a good book or a movie. How many of you have binge watched Netflix or Disney Plus? But there again, you need balance. A really important tip is going outside. Maybe not tonight, but going outside and playing in the dirt, planting. It has been proven to be a healing aspect of recovery for a lot of adolescents who are in residential treatment, is being in the outdoors and proving to yourself that you have strength and are able to have personal agency. Lowering anxiety with positive nightly rituals. On the left, we see there a journal, keeping a journal by your bed and writing down anxious thoughts. We've always talked about that. The other thing, though, that I think can be important is keeping a gratitude journal. Being able to think about the things that you have been thankful for during the course of the day is an important part of being able to keep a balanced view of life, particularly when things appear so bad. So I think before nighttime, it's really a good idea to think back over the course of the day. What do you feel grateful for? What are you thankful for? And then on the right-hand side, we see folks with their cell phones. The screen from cell phones and laptops have stimulating effects that have been proven to disrupt the quality of sleep. I know that this is hard to do, but I would implement a rule of no technology before one hour before bedtime for a better night's sleep. I would love to see the phones turned off and docked in your bedroom as a parent than your child having access to it. And the biggie here, practicing mindfulness techniques and stress reduction strategies throughout the day. Again, I think it's important to understand that mindfulness is not a mystical thing. It doesn't have to be a religious thing. It is more of an awareness of what's going on around us and what's going on in our minds and bodies. Meditation can certainly be a stress reduction practice. We did a little bit of a meditation at the beginning. I do want you to understand that meditation is not about, I'm going to say it again, trying to push thoughts out of your head. It will not work. Meditation is sitting quietly, paying attention to your breath. When thoughts arise, let them arise and say, there's that thought about my worry. I'm returning to my breath. And focus on the sensation of breathing in and out. And even young children can focus on the sensation of breathing in or out. They can watch their stomach protrude as they breathe in. They can watch it go back in when they breathe out. There are many meditation apps for adolescents and older adults. There are a couple of things that I think are quite helpful and things that I often teach when I'm working with students. And one of those is a practice called square breathing. This is particularly helpful for folks who are having a panic attack or having an anxiety attack. And square breathing involves breathing into the count of 4 in your mind. So then holding to the count of 4, breathing out to the count of 4, and holding to the count of 4. If you repeat that cycle 4 times, you will begin to notice a bit of a shift in the anxiety. One of the most practical aspects of square breathing is getting the amount of oxygen you breathe in equivalent to the amount of carbon dioxide you breathe out. A lot of times when you're breathing, when you're anxious, you're shallow breathing, you're taking in quick breaths, and you're building up, and we know that oxygen gets converted to carbon dioxide inside our bodies. So you're building up a whole lot of carbon dioxide, which can make you feel dizzy. So breathing into the count of 4, holding, breathing out the count of 4, holding, helps to make that recalibrated. Let me say a word here about these techniques. I often will introduce these techniques and talk about how important it is to practice them when you're not feeling anxious, when you're not having an anxiety attack or a panic attack. Inevitably, the student will come back to me and say, I tried it, it didn't work. Well, how many times did you practice? None. Did you do it when you were feeling anxious? Yes. How many times? Once. These things need practice, folks. So if you are sharing any of these techniques with your children or adolescents, it's just like any new skill that we learn, it takes practice. Sensory grounding. I love this practice. I find this to be really helpful for people who are in social situations and are just overwhelmed with anxiety. And sensory grounding puts you back in touch in the moment. So naming 5 things you can see, looking around you and just thinking about 5 things that you see. Naming 4 things you can touch. Naming 3 things you can hear from where you are. Naming 2 things you can smell. Name 1 thing you can taste. That puts you in the moment and less focused on how you're being perceived. This has been a very helpful strategy for some of my older adolescents who are in social situations during which they feel quite anxious. Now, this is RAIN for negative emotion, is a technique that I've not read a whole lot about for use with children and adolescents, but I have adapted it for use with children and adolescents. This is a technique that Tara Brach talks about in her book, Radical Acceptance. She also has a podcast that I highly recommend for adults with who want to develop mindfulness. And what RAIN stands for is to recognize, accept, investigate, and nurture yourself, or not identify with the feeling. I have found this to be helpful for children as young as 6 or 7 years old, particularly when their negative emotion, particularly anxiety, is forefront in their mind, and they're trying to manage that feeling. And I share with them, as I've shared with you tonight, you can't push that feeling out. Recognize it. You know, when you're feeling that tension in your chest, or you're feeling like your stomach is a little bit got butterflies, recognize that feeling, and then accept it. It's there. It may not be there for a reason, but let's think about, why might it be there? What might you be worried about right now? That's the investigative part. Is there something you need to take care of? Is there homework assignment that you might need to finish? Is there a test that you've got coming up that you need to study for? And then finally, nurture yourself. And that might mean doing the thing that you have investigated and figured out what you might need to do, but don't identify yourself with that feeling. That feeling is going to come and go, but that feeling is not you. It's like a wave in the ocean. It is going to get big and then it's going to go away and dissolve into the vast ocean. So recognize the feeling, accept it, it's there, investigate it, and then nurture yourself. Focus on your breath. That's a good way to nurture yourself, because focusing on your breath does calm you down. So rain for negative emotion. Okay, channel creativity and express yourself through art. Get crafty. Get involved in creative activities like drawing, painting, writing, journaling, singing. If you're feeling like things are getting out of control, expressing yourself through art is certainly a productive and healthy way to release that energy. For particularly crafty people, creating a vision board of what you want life to be like after the pandemic has become endemic. But cut out pictures of things, print out pictures from the computer of things that you want to be able to do, and put the board somewhere that you can refer to. And finally, staying active. Get moving every day. It is so important, even if it is a brisk walk or even a slow walk. A slow walk is meditative. I have found that for the kids who are not getting the activity, they seem to suffer quite a bit from the effects of this pandemic. So getting out, moving around on the bike, kicking the soccer ball, running, walking is really important. And again, I cannot overstate how important it is to stay mindful. Detaching our thoughts so that we have more choice in what thoughts we'd like to entertain. A lot of thoughts rise and fall. And if you've ever been to my office, you will see a little bumper sticker that says you don't have to believe everything you think. And that's an important point for all of us to keep in mind, because thoughts occur randomly. We don't have to believe them. We can choose the ones to believe in that are the healthiest for us. And namaste. The humanity in me recognizes the humanity in you. All right, I feel like I ran through that. I think it's time for some questions, Glennis, is it not?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Riddle, and very informative, helpful, useful information that I know all of us will be able to use moving forward. With that said, there are quite a few questions that we will try to get to as many as possible.
Q&A, I love it.
I know, right? I'm going to start with one that sort of came up frequently in the chat, and that is, if you expect that your child or a child may have anxiety, at what point would you suggest that the person seek professional support, and from where? And in the same idea, what is the best way to get your child evaluated for an anxiety disorder? Should you start with a pediatrician or go directly to a child psychologist? And then cost factors. How does seeking help become prohibitive for some families, and what can they also do? So a lot of questions in one, but around the same theme, David.
Okay. So if you will look at the references, the reference list, there are two books that I absolutely adore. and I have them top of the list. So the first thing I would recommend that you do is go out and buy Anxiety Relief for Kids, on-the-spot strategies to help your child overcome worry, panic, and avoidance, and Anxiety Relief for Teens, essential CBT skills and mindfulness practices to overcome anxiety and stress. I think they're probably something like 15 bucks or so a piece. The Anxiety Relief for Kids in particular is quite good at walking parents through being able to help their children themselves with cognitive behavioral strategies. And that is the therapeutic technique that is often used in addressing anxiety. It walks you through the development of a fear thermometer to use to help assess where one's level of anxiety and fear might be. It helps you to begin to think about scenarios of sort of least fearful to most fearful to be able to work yourself through. So I think probably the least expensive way would be to get one of these books and start trying to use some of the strategies that you find there. That being said, I would say the next, and maybe concurrently, go see your primary care provider. I am a firm believer, and I didn't include my three-circle figure this time around, but I think it's really important to take a look at the medical, anything that might be going on medically that could be contributing to any kind of anxiety. You know, if stomach aches are a frequent concern, then that, in my opinion, needs to be evaluated. I would hate for there to be some kind of obstruction that would be causing stomach aches. So yes, I think it does need to the next step would be seeing a medical provider. Beyond that, then I would have a conversation with the medical provider about who they like to refer to for treatment of anxiety disorders. Part of any good treatment strategy is going to be an intake where you're taking a look at all of the factors that are involved. We're looking at things like the child's birth history, early development, what their school history is like, what kind of challenges they have, what are their strengths. All of those subjects need to be assessed. If the person is expecting or suspecting that there could be it may be one of these co-occurring situations where there might be a learning or an attention problem, then some testing would help to ferret that out. As far as the cost, I know therapy is not cheap, but it is covered by most insurance plans. And usually, well, depending on the policy, can be a minimal copay.
And David, can I interject there too? Because as you were answering that, there was a question that came about medication and when should parents consider medication? When is that a good idea? With counseling, without counseling, what are the recommendations usually around medication use for anxiety?
Well, I purposely stayed away from that topic, but since it was brought up, I will talk about it. The first caveat is I'm a PhD and not an MD, so I cannot give medical advice. That being said, sometimes I find that in working with a child, if they are learning the CBT strategies and they are struggling, even with practice, to implement them in in vivo in the situation live, then they may be swimming up a very strong neurotransmitter wave. And then I would suspect that it would be time to take a look at a medication. I am a therapist at heart, so I'm not a big proponent of going the medication route first, but other people may have other thoughts on that. But I do think that even with medication, it's not going to totally get rid of the problem, and you do need some strategies.
Thank you. There also, you brought up that question around screen time. So, you know,
I
that
knew I would
conversation-
get questions about that.
Of course. I was like, no, David, we could spend all night trying to answer that. But quite
Yeah.
a few questions around, you know, the positive aspects of screen time, how to recommend and balance, you know, the better use of screen time, which I do think you touched on that a bit, but also thinking about how do you explain to your children that setting screen limits isn't meant to be a punishment, but to help them regulate 24/7 access to the world. So just some questions around thinking about better use of screen time, as well as explanations to children about that.
Well, I think what you just said, Glennis, is perfect in terms of this is not a punishment. This is, and a lot of times parents will use it as punishment. I think if you can get ahead of the misbehavior and say, this is the amount of time, and different families are going to have different amounts of time that they can tolerate that. This is the amount of time that you have. Here's how we're going to break it up. Here are the exceptions, but getting ahead of the use of it, I think, is really important. Now, should it be taken away as punishment? If you have established the rules and there is consistent breaking of the rules, sure. But my preference is not to use it as punishment first. Do not expect a kid to be able to regulate themselves on their screen time. Particularly for, I mean, I see this in all kids, but particularly if you have a child who has ADHD, that is some strong stimulation. And it's feeding their brain with that stimulation, and it is, and when you stop it, you will see the dysregulation that you get. You get, you know, tantrum behavior. And sometimes you get kids who will even, you know, become physically aggressive or will tear up their room, or, you know, even destroy the computer they're playing on. If it's gone that far, then you hadn't gotten ahead of it. So I think in that situation, it's probably a good idea to take a little bit of a break and reintroduce it after you have set some firm rules around it.
And David, that may have answered one of the other questions along video games. Can video games be addicting?
Yes. I think they can.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the criteria for addiction, particularly if they are using the games to escape, if they're using the games to, if it's beginning to interfere with academics, with social relationships, then I think you're up knocking on the door of addiction. But I don't think the use of video games is necessarily a sign of addiction.
There's also a question about allowing children to avoid situations that make them anxious. Can this inadvertently reinforce that those situations are indeed dangerous or scary?
Yes, a resounding yes. Now, having said that, I would say that those types of situations do need some preparation beforehand, and a graduated kind of a gradual exposure to that particular situation. But once the child is able to be in that situation successfully, what a great feeling of accomplishment that is for the child, and so important for their own sense of personal agency.
Great.
But I'm not a big fan of, you know, if a kid is, let's say, afraid of a dog, pushing the kid in front of the dog, I don't think is a good thing. I think there needs to be gradual exposure to that. Maybe starting out with a small stuffed animal, maybe not even the stuffed animal, maybe pictures of a dog even. So I think you need to step back as far as you can from that particular situation, and then slowly build using something like a fear thermometer, where, okay, let's think about taking a look at this picture of this dog. Where does it rate on the thermometer? So they say, oh, it's a 2. It's not a lot. Okay, good, it's a 2. How can we get it down just a little smidge under 2? And then work on the strategy for that. We don't, in using something like a fear thermometer and trying to help kids lower their anxiety, we're not going to go from 10 to 2 quickly. It takes time, just like you don't lose weight quickly and it be successful. And I can say that because I do that.
Okay, there's a question about navigating sibling relationships when one child has general anxiety disorder and perhaps is constantly comparing themselves to another sibling, or using that sibling as, you know, the standard for how things should be or not be. Is anything about navigating sibling relationships when anxiety is in the family?
Is there any way for me to ask the age?
Sure. If the person is still on the call, the child is 8.
And how old is the sibling?
Sibling is 5.
And is it the 5-year-old with anxiety?
The 8-year-old has anxiety.
The 8-year-old has anxiety. Okay. That is a tough dynamic because I'm sure they inhabit a lot of the same social spaces. They inhabit the same household. I think it's important to have pretty honest discussions about, we all have the things that we do well. We all have things that we feel better about than other things. And this is something that your brother is learning how to feel better about. Just like you have this that you're trying to feel better about. I think a discussion about what each child's strengths and challenges are would be important in dealing with that. I would not hold the 5-year-old back from doing anything because the 8-year-old would not want to do it.
And David, how do you prioritize treating ADHD versus treating anxiety?
That is a really good question, and I have spent a lot of my career on that question. So people will call in and present with either, well, anxiety, depression, or attention problems and academic difficulties. And this is where I think the importance of the intake comes into play. whenever I do hear anxiety, my antenna does raise about the possibility of an attention or learning problem, even if it's mild. Because I think a lot of times, particularly with bright students with mild difficulties, a lot of times we don't know how hard they are working to manage their inattention. And the energy that they're putting into managing their inattention or their reading difficulty is draining the psychological resources. So I do think it's important anytime a student presents with that, I am going to be looking for reason for anxiety rather than, or just anxiety itself. Family history is important in that. If there's a family history of anxiety, then I'm certainly going to think, oh, that this may be more of an anxiety. If trauma is present, if there's been an adverse childhood experience, I'm certainly going to be thinking more about anxiety. Absent that, then I'm going to be looking for other underlying factors like attention problems or subtle learning problems.
I'm going to shift some of the questions to specific classroom questions. One of the questions, I'm actually going to chime in a little bit, if that's okay with you, David.
I would love that, Glennis. You know I love your opinion.
Well, the question is, how can a classroom teacher best help a student suffering with anxiety without targeting them for attention from other students? And I'm just going to highlight that one of the things we do at Hill that has proven to be quite successful is we have a mindful moment that happens after recess break. And man, it has really changed some of the frustrations that students bring from the playground back into the classroom, and just having a calming effect. And the teachers have also used it at other times when they feel like there's just an overall heightened anxiety or frustration in the classroom, or just a chance to take a moment and calm the class overall. So I think as a classroom teacher, sometimes not thinking about it as individualizing, but like, let us all take a moment to take some deep breath, to practice those, what do we see, what do we hear, what do we feel, those kinds of things can be helpful. But David, what other kinds of advice do you have?
I love that. I think that's a wonderful idea. In addition to that, for a child with more significant anxiety, I think it is important to develop a sort of a private communication between the child and the teacher. So for example, let's say the child has a yellow index card that he or she might take up to the teacher and give it, go back to the seat, and then have the teacher say, you know, Ella, will you take this book to the guidance counselor? So that it gives the student a chance to go and collect him or herself, but not have undue attention paid to the student. So private communication, I think, is really important in that regard. If it's a classroom that, you know, moves around a lot, if there's a place where there can be a mindful corner, you know, similar to a reading corner where there might be some type of big soft cushion that has a lot of manipulatives or, you know, soft, furry, fuzzy things to help a child, and depending on the age, that might be an option as well. But I love the mindful moment. And in fact, Glennis, I went to a conference on mindfulness in education. This was pre-pandemic, but as you know, the research behind it is growing. It's quite effective.
Yeah.
even in some of the most, in the schools that you would think that it would not, inner city schools that have introduced mindfulness, the incidences of fights, bullying have decreased dramatically.
Also, back to the classroom, how can educators help students, especially around third graders who experience great anxiety over certain subjects like writing assignments, especially if they've been diagnosed with anxiety or depression or general lack of confidence? What are some things teachers can do to help with students who are having those experiences?
And I'm assuming this is coming from a teacher, and I would imagine he or she has tried this, but I would say that, and I think this is a technique that we often use with students with writing disorders, but I think it can be used for students with anxiety disorders, and that is to be a scribe for the student, where they are not having to, sometimes there's a perfectionistic tendency with anxious students. So if they can't come up with the content and put it on the piece of paper perfectly, then that is anxiety producing for them. So if you could, as a teacher or an assistant, have the student say, okay, let's think about some ideas that you want to think about. So you want to talk about trees, let's say. What would be something that you might say about those? And then the teacher write that out, or the assistant write that out. And then the student can copy what the teacher has written. Because writing is such a multi-determined process. There's the physical aspect of it, there is the creative aspect of it, there's the editorial aspect of it. And I think anytime you have a task that is that multi-determined, if you can break it down into the component parts, it's easier to take place.
And one other question, and this one might be a little controversial considering some of the arguments or debates, I should say, out there, but the question from an educator: how many minutes should teachers let a class of 30 outside for recess, grades 4th, 5th, and 6th, and in this case, a Montessori environment? Do you brave that question, David?
I don't work at a school. I'm going to defer to you, Glennis.
I was just thinking that we have a short recess and sometimes it's very long. But I personally believe that play is so important during a child's day. And especially if we can get children out in really using activity and exercise, and not so much planned activity all the time, but helping them just play, have a good time, come to their own appropriate devices for enjoying their recess time. To me, 30 minutes goes by very quickly, but I'm certain that depending on the school environment, the needs, the programs, it may have to come down to individual decision.
Yeah, and I think that is that's a good answer. The other thing that I would suggest is that a lot of it depends on what the makeup of the class is, because teachers know that every class they teach has a different personality, just like every child has a different personality. There are some classes that you might not want outside for that length of time because trouble's on its way. So I would say that spend some time at the first part of the year with assessing what is this class like, how they relate to each other, what kind of alliances form, what kind of exclusions happen, and then adjust the time accordingly. I don't think 30 minutes is too much, but for some kids it may be too much.
Great. And there's a question around, going back to some more specific parenting questions. There is a question around any advice on physically related anxiety that comes with puberty, self-conscious behavior surrounding height, pimples, comparison to others.
Stay off Instagram. This is where I think social media can be most harmful because there's so much anxiety about physical appearance in general, but particularly at this age. And when you see the image that these Instagrammers and these influencers, I think they're called, try to present, there's very little chance of being able to match that. So I think it's important to, as much as possible, restrict those images. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I hear more and more some of the panic around students feeling like, oh my goodness, I noticed something on Instagram or something happened or didn't happen, and how that affects their lives personally. So thank you for that. Another question from an educator, David, they said, I teach high school. What is a good way to help students with avoidance behaviors who are missing lots of assignments and get more and more panicked about it?
Get them an executive functioning coach. Sign up for the executive functioning class at Hill Center. No, I'm joking, but I'm serious. I think that one thing that I have noticed over the years is that we expect our students to do activities without with assuming that their executive functioning skills are going to develop naturally. And I think that there are students who don't have those skills for whom it does not come naturally, and they need specific instruction on that. I think if it's possible for any of that work to be done at school with a teacher present, not to be hovering, but I think one thing that we do find is that students with attention and executive functioning problems do better when there is someone else around. And if that person would be a person like a teacher, you know, they could ask questions, but also it's like a, you know, little bird sitting on their shoulder. I need to be working here. I would suspect that student probably does have some pretty significant executive functioning and attention issues. Sometimes I guess I would wonder if they would qualify for a Section 504 plan to maybe get some accommodation on reduced course or assignment. But I suspect the student is going to need some direct intervention on chunking the assignments and getting those done within a time frame, and better at school if that can happen than at home, because there are too many distractions at home.
That's great advice, David. Thank you. I know we're winding down. I'm going to try to grab 2 more questions depending on your answers. There are quite a few, but there's one around if you could comment on strategies for helping families with children who have school avoidance or school refusal.
That is a very tough problem, I will say. I think that is one of the situations where some professional intervention may need to take place. I would be curious to know whether or not there's any kind of learning difference that's going on that's making it hard for the child to refuse school. I mean, there's so many questions that I would ask. Has the child had adverse experience with being bullied? Yeah, I think a good assessment through a good intake would be the first thing that I would do. And I would try to avoid as much as possible walking the child into the classroom and leaving from the classroom. If the drop-off could happen outside of the school with the guidance counselor or some other designated school official who is kind and firm, I would recommend doing that. I have not seen it work well when the parent walks the child into the classroom and then tries to separate. My heart goes out to you parents for this. I mean, this is a really, really difficult situation that I do think needs professional intervention. And I'm sorry, I'm not taking the easy way out on that answer. It is a difficult situation.
I agree. Sometimes, David, it's just hard to get to the crux of what is creating it and take some time. So I think there's some grace period involved in tweaking out what's going on and helping the child in these situations. And then I'm going to end on this question. Is it a panic attack if it is in direct response to a situation, or only out of the blue does it get designated as a panic attack?
So a panic attack, so an anxiety attack is related to a specific trigger. A panic attack is out of the blue.
And then, David, as we wrap up, I know you have plenty of resources. There were quite a few questions. Maybe you can send some to us. We at Hill, of course, are happy to include some resources too for things like speech therapists, occupational therapists. There were questions around definitely psychologists. Maybe David Riddle's practice could help. So just some resources around that we'll be sure to try to include, along with some of the things you threw out tonight when you were suggesting some of the books and other resources. We'll make sure that's part of what the follow-up information is. So David, I want to thank you. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just would say those first two that I list under references, I would definitely recommend taking a look at that. And then the website, anxiety.org, and the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, the ADAA. I think I got all the A's right, maybe I didn't, but anyways, that is those are two really helpful websites, and have good sections on children.
Well, David Riddle, Dr. David Riddle, we'd like to thank you once again for your presentation and very useful information and strategies. I think we have all benefited from this presentation tonight. And
well,
once again, everyone, we look forward to seeing you for our next Community Ed series. And Beth, you might want to say something about that because I don't have the exact date, but thank you for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thank you. Our next session is February 3rd on executive functioning, and can pick up on lots of the things here as well. And I just want to add my thanks to all of you for joining us, for providing such great questions. I'm sorry we could not get to all of them, but thank you, Glennis, for doing a wonderful job moderating and sifting through them and adding your expertise as well. And David, as always, your empathy coupled with your expertise is just a magical combination, and we're lucky to have both.
Thank you.
And thank you. And as was said in the chat, We will follow up with the slides, with the recording tomorrow, and we'll try to capture some resources and share those as well. So thanks all. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening, and we hope to see you again on February 3rd.